So I'm going to start with a very short introduction from each of the people here, and then I'm going to throw it open, not so much for questions to the panel, although if you want to ask a question you're welcome to do so, but more for a general discussion of people to get involved and to think politically what we can get out of that. So I'm going to go in this order, starting with John Christensen, who is the director of the Tax Justice Network and has been working for many, many years to try to plumb the depths of exactly what's gone wrong in the passage of time from 45 till now. And I think that's my question to you, John.
The rot set in very early on. In fact, even as Attlee took power, the neoliberals were already fighting back. They'd organised, even before the war, starting in Paris, and almost immediately afterwards they started to convene meetings, to begin with, very covertly, but funded by others. They were absolutely determined not to allow the welfare state to flourish, and they did it partly by ensuring that every single step taken by any progressive government would be countered by, for example, the Bank of England ensuring that our exchange rate policies were never geared to assist with a proper post-war construction, to ensure that our tax policies in Britain were always geared to promote the interests of the rich. You heard Attlee talking about the rent seekers and the capitalists, and of course our tax policies have always been to their favour. And almost from the very, very start, their counter-attack included ensuring that not only were our tax policies geared to favour the rich, but also that our banking regulation would be undermined, and that the British capital could go straight back to its pre-war, in fact to its imperial past, because we in Britain never really had a very successful capitalism right from the start. Even though the Industrial Revolution began in this country, by the late 19th century we had already pretty much lost the productive battle. Our capitalism was already conceding ground to German capitalism, to French capitalism, above all to the United States. And we had become, or rather our banks had become, geared to the interests of financial capitalism. And the big project was to revive the power of the City of London by keeping sterling as high as possible, by making sure our tax policies always favoured the rich, by allowing Britain's tax havens to become very powerful at a global level to attract capital from across the rest of the world. By the mid-1960s, we were already, that is, we, the progressive forces, the left, was already beginning to lose that battle. The Bank of England was winning, the City of London was regaining its independence, and I would argue that by 1986, we had a completely different spirit in this country. The spirit of '86 was a spirit of greed. It was the spirit of neoliberalism. It was the spirit of deregulation, of privatising absolutely everything, of taxing middle and lower income households and not taxing the rich. That came from somewhere. That came from a massive project, very heavily funded and largely funded, it has to be said, from within Britain. It began with organisations like the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, the Mont Pelerin Society, which, look it up if you aren't familiar with this already. They had already invested virtually every single economics department. The vast majority of our newspapers already had journalists who had been indoctrinated by this idea that Britain's future lay with a deregulated economy, a powerful City of London. Now, as it happens, I grew up in Jersey. I grew up in a very privileged little island which was already by the 1960s emerging as a tax haven, and I grew up in that spirit which became predominant here, that spirit of socialism is a bad thing, everything collective is a bad thing, collective education is a bad thing, collective health is a bad thing. And these places, and Jersey in particular, saw the collections of bankers and so on, bankers, accountants, lawyers, who saw it as their project to undermine everything that progressive forces stood for. And they were prepared to sabotage every single effort. If they had to, they would sabotage sterling, and indeed they did in the 1960s and the 1970s. And they had very powerful allies in this process. They had, for example, the Bank of England, which right from the start right from the moment it was nationalised, saw it as their project to hinder every single thing that Attlee aimed to do. And in that respect, it was absolutely extraordinary that the first Labour government managed to put into place the National Health Service, the Education Act, and everything you saw there, despite the fact that right from the start, the City of London and its agents like the Bank of England were trying to sabotage their efforts. So to sum up, I think that the really big failing of the first Labour government was not to take control. They didn't take control of the Bank of England. They didn't take control of the banks. They didn't regulate the banks sufficiently. If we are to move forward, we must now roll back on the power of the banks. We must now put into place tax policies which actually tax the rentiers and the rent seekers and the capitalist class. We must tax land, because if you look at land ownerships in this country, it has one of the most concentrated land ownerships in the world. Over 70% of the land belongs to less than 1% of the population. We need to roll back on the power bases which by and large remain hidden. So I think that the mistakes started from the very outset, but we can learn the lessons now. And one of the lessons we need to learn is that our banking industry, far from being the gem that we delude ourselves into thinking this is what we're really good at, our banking system is completely unfit for purpose and must be completely changed, because without that we will not be able to restructure the economy back towards a productive rather than a rent-seeking economy.
Hi, I don't work in the city anymore, in case anyone's going to throw anything at me. I left quite a long time ago. I left for exactly the reason that has kind of been reiterated in various guises today, i.e. that the city, I discovered in my only less than 2 years there, was this centre of greed and, I mean, the nice word is aspiration, but it's greed, basically, and narcissism and all the things that I'm sure you imagine and now are coming out in the headlines and we kind of know all about. But in terms of why it's like that and why it's a problem and what we can do about it, it's a really, I mean, I'm sure some of you have had experiences and sort of are familiar with the financial industry, and it's a really strange place for anyone who hasn't been in it. It's hard to describe. From a personal perspective, it was like a bubble being there. I mean, anyone who's walked from Moorgate to here tonight, this afternoon, will know that it's a really weird place. It's a very different environment from, you know, your average part of the country. It doesn't represent the people or the place or, you know, anything about real life. And to be in it, that I can tell you that's exactly what it is like. It's removed from society. And I remember there were specific conversations like on bonus day, or when we were told our bonuses, you know, the amounts that we were going to be getting, someone who was a VP who would be getting probably, well, definitely in the six figures for their bonus, came back and sort of joked, it's like working for charity. And I kind of thought, oh, are you joking? You know, and these are the sort of hilarious, I don't know whether they're jokes or whether they're just, you know, kind of the way people are, but that's kind of representative of what goes in the city. And it's very, they are removed and aloof, and they know they are, and they don't need, it is, I mean, people talk about them and us in terms of how the riot started, and, you know, the people on the ground were saying it's them and us. Well, actually, the city thinks that. They know that it's them and us, and they are the ones in control and in power, and someone asked me the other day if it's got any better, as far as I can tell, in the last 10 years, because I left nearly 10 years ago, and I wish I could say, yeah, it's got better, but the only thing, as far as I can tell, that has happened is that people have become more aware of people watching them. So the city is very aware that, you know, the media and the people at the other end of the spectrum are kind of hating them, but I don't think they're doing anything to change the way things are. So I'm afraid greed and narcissism are kind of still ingrained in that culture. And because it attracts a certain type of person, it's this bubble that's self-contained and self-sustaining, really. And wish I had the answer, but I think I think regulation is one of the answers. But also, I mean, on a bigger scale, diversification of industry, therefore, so that we are less reliant on the city. But I mean, the city itself is just carrying on as it always was.
The structural changes and the structural challenges, are clear. But I want to bring a bit of politics into it, because the next speaker is Lord Maurice Glasman, a Labour peer. And in a sense, you heard right from the end there, the problem for us is not the Tory party, because the Tory parties remain constant. That's an unchanging body which is set up to satisfy the aspirations of capital. The problem for us is the Labour Party, and the stunning difference between the vision and the aspirations of the people we saw, Clem Attlee speaking there at Westminster Central Hall, Nye Bevan and the others. What's gone wrong? How can we get a Labour Party which will actually bring us back to that type of vision and that type of aspiration?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the best part of today for me was meeting the living wage campaigners outside. That brought back sort of very good memories of my life and of living wage campaigning. And the City Corporation of London said we started that campaign about 7 years ago, and to see that they've actually did now. This comes to the difficult bit. So I really hated that film. I thought it was manipulative, one-dimensional, propagandistic. I didn't like it at all, so I just got to get that out there and say that the 1945 government is a huge problem. It's a huge problem on 3 levels. The first is, which was kind of raised, that the model of nationalisation basically was a free pass for PPE graduates for 4 generations to rule us. And that's what we've still got. So the Labour Party was technocratic, managerial, Fabian. There was no worker representation, there was no user representation in the nationalised industries. This meant that they were genuinely authoritarian things. So if you look at the pre-existing trade union history, going back to the 1890s right up to 45, there were genuine ideas of worker ownership, partnerships, water run. They talked about the canals. That was constantly supposed to be a partnership between workers, locals, and users. That was all smashed by people who constantly stress the structural and what are we going to do. So I'm saying that I think your response to the film is naive. I think you're not looking at a whole range of problems relating to a very bureaucratic, administrative and elitist form of management that was characteristic of 45 that didn't do us any good at all. So the first is the nationalised industries, that was horrid. Secondly, the National Health Service, which we, when I sit in the Lords and I hear Labour peers speak at the National Health Service, I get a really full understanding of what it means to live in the Soviet Union. Every one of them, pays tribute to the heroism of the workforce and everybody that involved with the National Health Service. However, people are being abused and neglected in the National Health Service, and I don't know why we can't speak of this. And they're abused and neglected once again because, and the interesting thing with the nationalisation model, which wasn't brought up, I noticed Manny Shumwell vaguely appearing. Manny Shumwell invited the National Union of Mine Workers onto the boards and they wouldn't go. Right? They wouldn't go because trade unions in England and in Britain didn't want any form of partnership with running businesses. This was a catastrophe that we have to look at. Now, a very parallel world opened up in, of all places, Germany, where there was worker representation on boards. There was constraints on capital. Capital banks were endowed, they could not lend outside the regions and the sectors. So there was worker representation on boards, there was very vocational regulation of the labour market, and there was constraints on capital. Now the whole legacy of Thatcherism is, and it's a shocking thing, we saw it last week in the football, is that Germany won. Essentially, that's the shocker of 45, is that Germany went a different path. It wasn't nationalised, it was decentralised. It wasn't based on nationalisation, but partnership models. It wasn't based on PPE graduates from Oxford, but actual workers making decisions with managers who had actually some experience of working in the industry that they were involved with, rather than dependence on management consultants. So this is a huge issue that I want to raise. So I just want to say that it was really great meeting the workers at the door. It was really a lot worse watching the film for me. And to see Tony Mulhern on, a militant SWP figure as a kind of casual observer in the thing, just added to the general unbearable idea that I was being deceived. So I just want to put that out there. So on the one hand, you had a huge problem with nationalisation. On the second hand, you had a massive problem with state centralised administrative systems. But the third level, and the worst level, is that it didn't challenge capital. This is the terrible thing. The City of London remained completely outside of parliamentary jurisdiction. There was no constraints on the way that the City of London operated outside those constraints in terms of global capital and the maritime economy. So, I know you want me to fit, but that's where we are, is we have to rediscover each other. We have to discover the pre-1945 labour movement that didn't surrender all power and authority to social science graduates and economists and accountants, and the rest of the people who've been bossing us about for the last 60 years. And what we've got to do is organise each other to challenge the domination of both capital and the state. And that's the dilemma we face.
We have 4 minutes left. 1 minute each. The democratic allocation of time, starting now.
Well, for me, I start from a worker. Fact that they're reduced to a commodity, and human beings have to cease being commodities. In order to live, they have to sell their labour. I want an economy and a society which is human, cooperative, not competitive, and where democracy doesn't end when you walk through the door to start working, but that is the core of democracy.
Well, who would have thought? So capitalism is based on the commodification of human beings and nature and the maximum returns on investment, which can only be resisted, in my view, by democratic association. That's the key role that I think that unions and forms of civic self-government. So I think where we've got to go to is precisely to assert the non-commodity status of human beings and to build the organisations and the relationships necessary to protect the human integrity of the person and the country they live in.
This is looking good. Keep going, Polly. I'm liking the
bar is
brevity as well.
I just wanted to quickly pick up on the things that the two ladies on either side of the room said, which is that we're playing on a level a global playing field, and so you can't think about anything in isolation. And on that note, I think new models like interest-free and that there are all sorts of ethical models coming out. And I think it's great, but I don't see them making much headway. And I think the main way we can make headway is have politicians who understand the bigger picture, who are willing to put in place structures that are quite bold, including tax structures that actually do claw back some of the money from those kind of oligarchs, really.
Well, so far all very good. Obviously, coming out of a cooperative movement, I think that the cooperative movement is what was missing from this film. Actually, the labour movement was much more than central planning or 5-year plans, and Britain, above all, has a very strong tradition of cooperative, not just retail cooperatives, but cooperatives going back to the 19th century and before. And if you look at one of the strengths of the German economy, which is what you were talking about, their cooperative banks have been at the heart of their development at regional level and at local level, right the way through from the 19th century. And we should be looking to that cooperative model, not necessarily as a third way, but as one alternative, but as a better way indeed. And I think, but getting to the point about internationalisation, I think it is time that we revive the spirit of international cooperation, because one thing that's missing from this spirit of 45 was also the United Nations. What happened there? They, of course, won the war. It was the United Nations that won the war, and then came forward with this ideal that we'll move forward to an era of international cooperation. And if we want to tackle the Schmitz and all the other tax avoiders, we have to arrive at new international rules for taxing multinational companies, which of course is what Tax Justice Network is all about. And to do that, we have to revive the spirit of international cooperation that came out of 45.
And I want to actually just build on that with the final comment before I hand it over to Deb to close, that there are actually some very inspiring examples from around the world of societies in transition away from capitalism. Societies which recognise that is a long-term project. And I'm thinking particularly in Latin America in the last decade. You're thinking about Venezuela with mass nationalisation, the taking back of the commanding heights of the economy, mass expansion of cooperatives from 1,000 when Chavez took over in 97 to 180,000 by the time he died earlier this year. Bolivia, Ecuador, these are experiments with no predetermined blueprint, experiments which have involved an enormous amount of democratic popular participation. And they offer real signals of hope, I think, for around the world. It's not just in those countries. You get places like Iceland, which has already had its own constitutional assembly to rethink the constitution there. You get Tunisia and the Arab Spring and all of that. So there are models of hope which I think we can hold to. I'm going to hand it back to Debs, but I do want to just have a big thank from my part first to all of our participants and everybody in the room. Thank you.
This has been a wonderful end to a really great day. I want to thank also our volunteers. We've had a lot of volunteers who have helped us make today happen. To all of our speakers, to our panellists, thanks a million. It's been a really good day. And just keep abreast of what Tax Justice Network are doing. And I'm thrilled to say we have just developed a film about the power of cooperation, which we're hoping to get funded over the next year. So it's been lovely to have you all. Thank you.
Thank you.